Welcome back to Game of Thrones Weekly. From the gold mines of the Lannisters to the Iron Bank of Braavos, we're talking the economy of Game of Thrones. Stay tuned.
You're tuning into the destination for TV superfan discussion, AfterBuzz TV. And now, let the buzz begin.
Bag of gold. Got my bag of gold on my mind. Sipping on Dornish wine. Lay back with my mind on my bag of gold. Bag of gold, my mind. I don't got my, you got me, Anthony? I don't got me. But, alright, welcome back, everybody. I think we're here. I think we're live. You know, we never know. We cut these shows live. Hopefully, it's picking me up. There it is. Okay, great. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Game of Thrones Weekly. I'm your host, Ryan Malaty, and we have some special guests here today. To my left, we have Jeremy Dann, an entrepreneur and innovation professor at USC's Marshall School of Business. Hello, Jeremy. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be back.
And we also have Chris Hill, a venture capitalist and former real estate investor.
Excited to be here.
Excited to have you here and your expertise in this field. And we also have Ross.
Just Ross.
He's a boss. So, what's up, dude? Welcome back.
Thanks,
This
man.
is great.
Thanks.
On last week's episode, we talked about We Know Nothing, Jon Snow, and we actually brought up a lot of interesting questions that we didn't really have the answers to, kind of concerning society in general and all the underlying functions of that universe that Game of Thrones exists in. Not something that necessarily is talked about a lot because it doesn't necessarily, it's not intrinsic to major plot points, but this is a universe that George R. R. Martin created and D.B. Weiss and those guys, and they made a big one, and it has its own rules, and it lives what seems to be in the land of feudalism. What seems to be, I don't know. So I want to open up and talk to you guys about that. Let's talk about like the basic form of economy that would be formed under feudalism and how it compares to how our human history operated in medieval Europe and across the world, and how it compares to
Yeah, absolutely. So I
Westeros.
think they took very much sort of the idea of what was England like in the 12th, 13th, maybe even going a little bit into the 14th century, which
Right.
was entirely agrarian. Pretty much the entire population were going to be all farmers, and basically they paid rent to the nobles, who then basically took the food as opposed to killing them. That was pretty much the sort of the fundamental
Yeah,
rule. It's
so
like
it went on the bottoms of serfs, right?
bottom of the serfs, and then you sort of have the nobles
Peasants.
and then peasants, and then you have your nobles who they sort of pay their their rent to, and then you actually have the king and the nobility sort of on top of that.
So nobles would be like lords, and it's
Lords.
kind of like when they say Littlefinger, we're going to make you lord of Harrenhal. Now he's a noble,
Yep.
and he has rights to lands.
Yeah, or if you think about
And-
like the Karstarks or any of sort of the smaller who probably when they always talk about where those soldiers coming from, where's like that land and that power coming from, it's all based off of the land, the people that are working underneath them.
So it goes. You have the king and queen. Where does their wealth come from? Their money come from? Where do they derive that kind of power? Because we know that the Lannisters, they had their money from the gold mines, which is
Yep.
literally like you guys made a point earlier in your notes. It's like printing their own money. Was that kind of how it was in our human history? Is that how we derived wealth?
So it's actually one of the big differences between the show and if you think about England, which was almost all taxes. Like when you think about going back to like Robin Hood and all those other cases, it's like, why did
Tax
everyone get upset? It
collectors.
was all about the tax collectors. It's like
Right.
you're paying too many taxes. And they never talk about taxes at all on the show. It's like somehow or other, all of the lords, the Karstarks, whoever may be supporting, whether it's the Starks or the Lannisters, they're happy to show up and fight for years at a time purely because they're told to. Which doesn't seem to really make a tremendous amount of sense when you think about it. But as opposed to, like in England, when they're fighting the French, every single time that the King of England would go and say, hey, we want to go across the channel, we want to go fight, we're going to need to raise some money, and by the way, I'm going to tax you for that. And then eventually what ended up happening was the lords got upset and basically rebelled.
And wealth is very extractive especially in the Westeros economy. I mean, you have the gold mines, you have agriculture. We're not really seeing many other bases of of large wealth forming. So whenever you have an extractive culture, people are tied to certain lands, and you can contrast that, and we'll be talking about this quite a bit with Essos, where it seems like much more of a trading oriented dynamic economy where they're building wealth in society, not just the wealth of the state, everything channeling through the government. It's more merchant-led and trade-led rather than kind of government-led and feudalism-led.
Yeah, we have this the exotic nature of Essos contrasts with Westeros, and kind of the same sense that medieval Europe kind of contrasted with the New World. I mean, Essos has, and just to bring it back real sec, I do remember actually they did bring up taxes once. I remember when Ramsay Bolton was talking about how he flayed someone or another, and and then the kid, he's like, yeah, well, the kid paid his taxes after that kind of thing. But you're right, there's not much talk about it. But and over in the east, in Essos, you have cities like Karth, who are, I guess, how would you call that, self-contained? I mean, literally.
Well, they're almost like city-states that were happening around the Mediterranean Sea, North Africa, the Middle East, and beginning to be seen, in Italy. More merchant-led. We even see Karth. They have the 13, a merchant council. Remember, the person that comes out is the king of spices. He's a humble spice trader that has a ton of wealth. Yeah. In a lot of the Eastern economies, spices were one of the largest drivers of wealth in bringing those. So you could see those economies really have a big difference in our, to my eye, more ornate, more developed in the cities, better infrastructure, grander.
What would you call that? Would that be an aristocracy, or where you have just the rulers are basically the most wealthy and the ones that are creating all the jobs, and they kind of come together as like the elite? Is that what that be? An aristocracy or an oligarchy?
It's also called a plutocracy.
Plutocracy.
Yeah, which is the plutocrats, wealthy merchants, etc. And that's the one where we really get an inside look. I don't know to what extent we know the governing structures of the other cities over there.
Mm-hmm. But you would assume it's probably similar to Venice or to the Medicis during the early Renaissance, and how at certain points they weren't nobles, they weren't a king, but they held more influence than the Pope did.
Running the city.
Yeah, they were the ones running the city.
Right.
And you have how does a society like the Dothraki, for example, survive? I mean, what's their economy look like? Because they basically don't believe in money. I believe the last time we saw, Khal Drogo deal with gold, he was pouring it on some guy's head. They don't really value gold in the way that the rest of the world does. And why is it that gold or precious metals inherently seems to be
currency?
A currency at all? When you have a society that seems to function like the Dothraki, where they don't believe in money at all. How do you have these two? You have the wildlings. They don't really believe in money either.
Well, the wildlings, they're like beyond society. I mean, that's part of when they talk about being beyond the wall or up north, is that they don't adhere to any of the rules. None of the traditions or expectations of what Westeros is like. That's not how they live, and money would be one of those. The Dothraki, they don't. One of the things that was sort of interesting in the last two seasons, when you actually realize they do in fact have at least one permanent encampment. But where they sort of all sort of gather, but it's not like a city in the way that King's Landing or Bravos is. It's much more sort of religious and significant. Significance.
More primitive, I guess.
But
very primitive.
The Dothraki do have a business model. I don't think they sack every city. They come up to the walls.
Right. That's
they
true.
demand tribute. They get a few 100 slaves, they get some jewels, they get some things that they then, at the edges of their society, they probably do have some traders that then use some of that. I mean, they
go off and get.
They did have a business deal to get Daenerys.
Yeah,
they did. That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They do negotiate.
They're very savvy negotiators.
Right.
But then again, you're right. They don't really. They're kind of just they're just kind of dust in the wind. They don't settle, and there's nothing to really show for it. Whereas you have these other societies that have built giant pyramids and giant infrastructure that hasn't. It doesn't really seem like they do build those anymore. It was kind of a few generations ago. Kind of like almost mirrors our societies, how we have all these really old, beautiful buildings made of stone that just lasted centuries, and we just don't do that anymore.
Yeah, it seems like there's been underinvestment in the infrastructure, especially of Westeros. In medieval towns, in Renaissance towns, you would have certain projects under construction for decades, generations, and you would see scaffolding up. we hear about
The closest scaffolding we
Winterfell.
saw, the closest scaffolding we saw was the wooden church they were going to build. At the sort of the
with the
end,
hound.
the hound, and
Right.
that didn't go out. That was
Yeah.
That's
that
the
was a very
biggest
temporary
project.
But is that literally the biggest project we've
The biggest infrastructure project
Yeah.
in all of Westeros that we see. We see no evidence of anything new in that regard, or having even recently happened in Westeros, or in the reign of Robert, or even some of these things would have been in the works decades before that.
But I think a lot of that has to do just simply because of who Robert was as a leader. I mean, a lot of the major infrastructure projects, they were because you had someone, a king or an emperor, someone who said, I'm going to build this, and it was all ego. It was like, I'm going to build this, and it's going to be my lasting testament. Robert wanted to go hunting. He didn't care about maintaining infrastructure. He clearly didn't care about maintaining the treasury. That was one of the first things we learned in the first season,
Right.
is that basically the Iron Throne is broke because of all the parties and everything he threw. So the idea that he would spend 20 years building infrastructure is, we don't.
It's not his style.
No, well, I mean, look,
not his
it's not our style here. I mean, we're most of the roads in the U.S. are,
They're already built.
they're done, and we should be rebuilding, and we don't. So, it's just not sexy.
Yeah, that's right. We get Elon Musk to make some tunnels or something. That seems kind of new, but other than that, yeah, you're right. Infrastructure is pretty much already well founded.
You'd think Robert would really want to knit together that kingdom. His main allies were in the north. You'd think he'd want to be able to have not only trade that gets people more into the fold, but a way to mobilize if he ever needed people in his support. Didn't invest in that. And you would think that the Targaryens would have knitted together the kingdom. I mean, they were their own usurpers and uniters of the whole realm. They didn't appear to invest in that either. King's Road is a goat path.
Every time they show the King's Road, you'd think it'd be paved or something, or have like some banners.
Cobblestone.
Yeah, something.
They use it frequently.
Even when it's approaching the city, it doesn't seem to be that way. Which
It's like a dirt road.
it's all just a dirt road. So you're right. Weaving together those city-states would probably have some kind of economic, benefits, wouldn't it? I mean, how are these? They're called the kingdoms, but what are they really? I mean, because they're not necessarily. They're kind of ruled over by the Iron Throne, but they're kind of self-sustaining.
Self-ran.
Yeah, the majority of it's all going to be local. It's going to be no different than any other medieval society where the bulk of the trade was between the farmers or the small towns with maybe the center town. They're none of those people. They're not traveling to King's Landing. They're not going, to visit other parts of the north. If you're near, the Boltons or near, any of the other locations, that's where you are. You're born, you raised, and you die there. Yeah.
And as a result, you rarely have the opportunity to try new spices, new foods, new textiles. Basically, you just live in a burlap sack, farm potatoes or whatever you happen to be able to grow on your land, eat that until you die of dysentery or whatever it is, because there's no hospitals anywhere. So this lifestyle that the common people are living doesn't seem to be one that I'd be envious of.
But they're going to have a need to travel, though. Because if you think about it, they're not that educated, so a lot of them probably don't even know the history of what's around them, so they don't know what there is to go and see, and they have everything they need to survive right there.
Well,
so.
even the most educated, when you think about the Starks, how often do they refer to old man stories as if that may in fact be the case, which it turns out it is.
Yeah.
Right. Spiders as big as hounds.
Yeah. And they probably know more than anybody else does.
Right. Because they're educated, which is power.
I want to ask you guys about the value of a gold dragon. Okay. Do we still base the value of our dollar on our gold reserves, or how does that work? And how would the people and the governments of Game of Thrones and Bravos or whoever determine what the value of a single piece of gold is?
Well, see, that's a difference. About 50 years ago, the system that went off the gold standard, our currency is based on faith in the federal government of the United States. So we are, and all of our debts in the United States are denominated in dollars. We get an option to essentially inflate ourselves out of any debt by printing money.
What do you mean by inflate? Let's sort of talk through that. What does that mean?
Well, we could, the federal government, if we have a $20 trillion debt right now, could literally do a one-time print $20 trillion and pay everyone off, but then the faith and credit of the government is gone forever. So you rely on that. I mean, that paper money is just paper, but it can be used to pay debts to the government. No one really has to accept paper money. It's just because at the end of the day, you agree that you could eventually exchange it in for your debts to the government. But this is a society that has, yes, it's still gold-based, silver-based, but we see mostly the bags being thrown everywhere. Tyrion is very good at throwing bags around.
Flinging coins.
Flinging bags.
He's great
and
at that.
It's still the currency in circulation, I believe, from the Targaryen realm. They didn't start printing Baratheon heads. They have the dragons. And they'd be losing a lot of liquidity in their economy, the ability to exchange, if the Lannisters are running out of gold. Where is literally their gold coming from? We call it, that would be deflationary, the fact they don't have enough currency, enough liquidity to support their economy now.
Yeah, so what's eventually, if there is no more gold to be mined, what is the future of the gold standard in the Game of Thrones universe? If ultimately there's a finite amount, will they eventually have to switch to a paper, a means of paper, currency transaction, or
Well, part of it is just simply that each of those gold dragons is just worth more, and so some of the things that were like, oh, I can buy 2 flagons of wine for a single gold dragon. Now that's no longer the case, because you're not willing to give up that, because there's such a limited supply of that form of money in circulation. So you value it more. So therefore you expect other things for it at a much higher level than you would have previously.
So prices pretty much trickle down from supplier, from merchants, from the ports. Where is this happening? Most of these major cities are in ports, right?
Yeah.
Is that where all?
We only know of a few cities in Westeros. It's very rural economy still. Yeah.
Yeah, we have King's Landing, obviously.
Old Town,
which is where the Citadel is,
Yeah.
which is where I guess all of
Knowledge.
Yeah, like
all the knowledge resides
all in one place.
What's how do they get funding? Probably through what? Taxes, the king's subsidies, probably, right? They finance the Citadel.
Yeah, they have a deal with basically like they operate as a city-state within where they don't have to provide as much to King's Landing, and so they kind of have they're one step removed, where they're like, hey, all the taxes that come into Old Town, we get to keep those and maintain them. There'll be some deal that would have been cut along those lines, because you never actually hear about Old Town as part of the kingdom whatsoever. It almost does operate like Bravos or any of the other places in Essos.
Yeah. And as a professor at school, how do you see the education system in or the lack thereof in this universe?
It's terrible. Education is a big part of human capital, the labor force, which is a big part of any economy. We see very little evidence of education in the world of Game of Thrones, which would enhance your scientific progress, enhance your architecture, enhance everything. And
the only science improvement so far we've seen is Frankenstein, effectively.
Exactly.
It's pretty much. I think there might be a reason that they're not that inclined to go ahead and share that with more people.
Even in Europe, we know of way more, medieval universities, more centers of knowledge, more repositories where they had books. We just have the one place with books, hand copied, much too much centralization.
It seems like most of the children only really learn about the histories of like the old kings and queens of lore, but you're right, there really is no evidence that anyone's being taught about math or astronomy or science or anything like that. When does that become like an inherent human yearning? When do the people start saying, I want my kids to learn? Is it when they have enough food and security? At what point is it as a priority of the people? Because they don't seem to be rising up and saying, we want education reform.
No, they want to get fed first.
Right.
It's not a necessity
yet. When at the point that education could provide a better quality of life, and you see that as a means to moving into the middle class or becoming a merchant, then that becomes something that you would consider. But you look at Davos, for example. He didn't learn how to read until
Knigget. Knigget.
Knight.
Sorry, Knight. Yeah.
And he was clearly a very he was the onion. He was a successful trader. He worked a variety. So there was clearly no need for anyone else who's comparable to them to have the same level of education.
You can survive in this world without knowing how to read because there's
Oh yeah.
no signs anywhere. They're all sigils. They're all there's images of birds and lions. Like, oh, I know what that is because it's a thing.
I'd say force would get them farther too. I mean, just look at the Dothraki. None of them know how to read or write, and they still a very successful tribe. And they run things the way that they run them without having any need of any of the culture of the outside world, without books or reading or history. Yet still, they're a force to be reckoned with.
Sure.
But eventually, certain societies saw the. I mean, the United States was. I mean, now we're talking well outside the kind of time frame that's a parallel to this, but saw a strength in deepening your bench in society, so to speak. That you enable many more educated people. But it was a product of, again, having your agrarian revolution, freeing people from the fields. Remember, the United States was still a 95% agrarian economy itself until the early 1900s. So throughout most of human history, 98, 97% of people were tied, including kids, to the fields. Therefore, kids would rarely get education, maybe a little bit during the winter when the
times were a little slower.
Yeah.
You didn't have to be up
fields.
dawn until
Not
dusk
as much
working
work
the
to be
field.
done, right?
Yeah, and I guess what's the point, right? I mean, if you don't have to learn something to stay alive, if you're worried about feeding yourself and surviving dragon attacks, I mean, reading books is not high up on your priority list, but it is a kind of a low value of human capital, and just for everybody in general. We have education system is real low. Participation of women seems to be real low. There's not so much a discrepancy of race, it seems, in this universe, which is surprising because that seems to be such a prevalent issue in our human history. But for them, I don't feel like, I guess the people who get the most trouble are dwarves, but you don't really see anyone making comments on, I mean, I don't see any relevance of race being like a hindrance in the workforce or in politics. You have a really diverse council, what it seems to be. I mean, Karth, you had, seemed to be like, someone hailed from everywhere. They all self-made men and women from everywhere.
But you did have slavery.
You did have slavery, but
so clearly not everyone was handled.
It was equal opportunity slavery because the masters had slaves of all races. It appeared that were probably often the bounty of war, and then grew up in the servitude.
See, I'm curious about that because how do you distinguish? What's the criteria for becoming a slave or being a free person in this? Is it one of those things where it's just a lineage kind of thing where you're born of a slave, so you are a slave? Or because I mean, it's a stark difference in this country's slavery history. It was like, oh well, you're black, you're probably a slave, but and then I guess if you take it back, across history, there's always seems to be a different demographic of people who are used for free human labor. Like, what's the criteria in Game of Thrones? How do they?
It'll be power, I'd imagine.
You're my slave because I said so.
But it's the family structures too. The noble families, like obviously they'll be treated different because they have more power. And whereas someone else, that'll come in also, like if they have uses as well, like if they're a useful laborer, like they're going to be used as a laborer, especially if they can't read or write. Like that's where anyone who would come in and have the power to like take or capture a group of people would use them as such.
And I mean, that's the key. Throughout most of human history, if your tribe was defeated, if your city-state was overrun, that's what led people to be in slavery in the Middle East. Romans had tons of slaves.
Romans
as
had
well.
slaves from what is present-day Spain, what is present-day France, Germany. I mean, that was sort of the that was the norm. It was just simply a question of what rights were given to slaves in a respective society, and that's varied, quite a bit. If you were a slave in Rome, that is a very different experience, and across a variety of levels than if you were a slave in the South, 150 years ago, which is very broad generalization to say the least.
Right. And
Daenerys has outlawed slavery in Slaver's Bay, and yet that was kind of a very abrupt shift and change in the way that their economies ran. So what happened was, as we saw, most of the families still offered the opportunity for these slaves to work in exchange for room and board and a contract, 2 years at a time or whatever Daenerys said. is that just slavery with a different name? Like, what's happening over there, and how would an economy get shell shocked like that if you just say, oh, by the way, your entire workforce is now needs to be paid? I mean, because it's almost like raising the minimum wage from 0 to, whatever. How does that when people talk about minimum wage, raising the minimum wage, it always has shockwaves.
A system of slavery is still expensive in its own way. So, there is the suppression factor that is very expensive in a society. There's the fact that you have labor not fully, at times, utilizing its full capacity and its full strength because they don't like the fact that they're enslaved, and you have to have the overseers, etc. A capitalist free market economy with everyone as an actor kind of self-reinforcing through the invisible hand of the system is in some ways a cheaper method of allocating resources and talent.
So you think that it's going to go on the up and up here and out? It could. I mean, no more slavery, but they still, there seems to be kind of peaceful. To be honest, I don't know who's running things over there right now. Is it Dario Nahara? Like, what
exactly.
Is it? Who's running the world?
He seems like
over
a
there?
great administrator. He'll get everything going really well.
I really am curious because she set up she toppled governments, and then she set up her own rules, and then she left. What's happening over there?
Right. But the majority of the city, the morale is boosted, and she's done a huge service to the majority.
But for how long? Yeah,
Exactly.
I mean, it was like they were, when they're given their rights and everything, I was like, yes, but then they have to figure like, okay, but someone has to now pay me.
Right.
To the earlier point, it's like I now need a job that's going to pay me so I can take care of my family or to pay myself. Where beforehand that was
before,
was part of it, which it's incredibly disruptive in a way that becomes very difficult for both sides and doesn't really work as a normal transition.
Well, another thing that's interesting about the elimination of slaves in that part of the world, it's not just the labor being done on a daily basis or whatever, it's the fact that, for lack of a better term, slavery was a form of capital, much in the same way of gold. It was a store of wealth and continual wealth. So now there's a diminution of the capital store of that whole region. So you wonder not just kind of how is that economy going to work on a daily basis, but how do they start to plan their economy like years going forward, because that form of capital, they have much more gold and they have much more wealth in merchant classes, but that slavery as capital is gone.
It seems to be ran, I guess, if Dario's not in charge, it would have to be ran by the most affluent families with the deepest ties to their traditions within the city. I mean,
but they would want to go back to slavery. I mean, again, because that goes back to it being a have and have nots. They've their power was disintermediated by Daenerys coming in and basically saying you're now going to have to treat people as human beings, which they were not treated as human beings beforehand. And they're like, well, that's expensive, and it's an awful way to think about it, but that
Right.
they've made it very clear they don't think throughout when they sort of ambush and sort of say, hey, like we're and they threaten Daenerys, and they basically say like, look, we don't consider you human. You are anyone who was a slave is not a real person, and that is sort of how they rationalize it.
Right.
Well, we did hear that one slave that petitioned
petitioned
Daenerys
Yeah.
said that's how he being that slave and being in that role made him feel like more of a real person. He was an educator. He was respected in that family. He was a source of knowledge. But yes, the majority, the vast majority.
I don't like it. Yeah. I mean, that old guy over there, he's okay. He's institutionalized, but I got dreams. I want to get out of this one-horse town. Speaking of horses, I gotta know. All right, I'm gonna jump. This is something I really wanted to talk about. We'll get to the entrepreneurial fact of things, but I want to talk about technology. I want to talk about technology in this world, right? It seems like I feel like the only two things that I can think of off the top of my head right now that I've seen as a technological improvement was Joffrey's crossbow. He's like, check this new invention out. You don't even have to wind it. You just,
Back.
and it was like, okay, I guess that's cool. But like the top inventors of the world, because it's the king we're talking about, right? That's what they come up with. And then the other one was another type of crossbow, which was the scorpion. It's like this brand. They're like, whoa! It's like mind blowing. It's just a bigger version of a crossbow.
Yeah, I mean, they go into the tunnels and they have the big reveal, and it's a big crossbow, and it's not even that big, and it shoots one at a time.
Yeah.
So yeah, technology is.
It reminded me of in The Hobbit. Would they shoot the big black
the giant arrows?
The black arrow, the black arrows.
big black arrow? Right,
The
exactly
bard
that.
shoots.
You
Yeah.
gotta hit him in that one spot where
Yeah.
he's got
He's missing arrows. Yeah.
So in Game of Thrones, we see no evidence of the advance of technology in recent, at least decades, maybe even centuries. I mean, think of the technology it took to build the wall, and we see the cool elevator. That's better than anything they seem to have created elsewhere. Valyrian steel. Everyone thinks it's so badass. There's like 12 known swords of Valyrian steel. Like there's almost none of it. How did they not kind of find out how to make it? Now, there are a lot of examples in our history of knowledge lost to the ages. So it's not like the growth of technology is just this unceasing path forward. I mean, methods of medicine, methods of architecture are lost for generations. Even the Europeans, they had the Greek, the classical knowledge, then went out of fashion for centuries, and it was the Arabs and those cultures that kind of preserved a lot of that. So
And
I think we see
subsequently rediscovered as they came up through Spain and had completely forgotten all of that.
Yeah, so we see probably a culture that has maybe even lost some of its own technology and greatness because they're not building, they're not designing, and technology as a part of the economy hugely disappointing.
Well,
Yeah.
it is, but I think you also have to think about like where is the technology? So there's that conversation earlier about Old Town. I mean, the Meisters who are the most knowledgeable are locked, in with themselves. They have no outside of incentives. They are, studying things for their own sake. I mean, you actually see, when Sam is trying to discover a new way to treat grayscale or to read this, but that idea of actually exploring and developing new concepts, it becomes very clear that that's actually not what
It's not embraced. It's not
it's
encouraged.
No, it's a looking back. It's a looking forward. And again, you don't have the king or somebody saying, going to Old Town saying, "Look, guys, you need to come up with better solutions."
Right.
Yeah.
They seem to operate independently. Like where a lot of technology advancements come from is because there is some outside pressure where you have competing economies that are looking to get a competitive advantage, or you're looking, or you have the exchange of ideas. You don't see any of that, within the show whatsoever.
And you look at it, Qyburn too was an innovator.
He's the best technologist.
And he's thrown out.
He's the Da Vinci of Game of Thrones, the inventor. Like this man can make anything, and his bold techniques of experimenting got thrown out.
Remember, a lot of the advancement of technology, for instance, the Renaissance was rich families of the city-states that became patrons of the arts, architecture, medical science, and to get that kind of cross-pollination. It's called the Medici effect. We don't see anyone learning from each other. No one appears to be a patron. We'll talk about the arts, I think, a little later, but of science in any way.
Yeah, and it always struck me as a curious thing. I'm a pretty curious person, and you would think that just in the inherent curiosity of people would spark some kind of, need for something. I never see anyone playing with toys or games or just anything that they're mainly just sticks in the mud.
Well, they're surviving. I mean, the average, notwithstanding the war and plague and everything else, the average life of someone in Westeros is probably 30 years, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah, you're how am I going to get through the next harvest? How many, do I have enough food put away? Are the Lannisters or the Starks coming over the corner, over the hill, like in the next week, and like going to burn everything I just spent the next 6 months? I'm going to starve to death.
Yeah.
Those are the things that they're thinking about. And again, they can't read. Their education is based off of entirely what's being told around there.
Songs and stories. That's all they got.
A part of that can be traced to the economy as well. That again, when you're 90-something% agrarian and you are a hand-to-mouth economy and subsistence, first of all, you don't have a lot of time for leisure. You're not demanding it. But even the rich families of Westeros, we don't see evidence of support of the arts. All the keeps are sometimes impressive, but they're pretty austere. I think we have more example in the trading economies of Essos. of even think about Karth and remember when they're walking around the garden and there's so many objets d'art, objects of art that the Dothraki are kind of judging how much they could steal for. And we see the Titan of Braavos. We see the big statue of the Harpy, that Sphinx-like character in Marine. There's a lot more of investment in arts and what you might call entertainment. We see a traveling troupe of minstrels and actors. We didn't
that whole story,
only at Joffrey's wedding did we see any equivalent of that. And we've been in Westeros most of the show, where we're in Braavos 10 minutes and we see this like rich band of artists traveling around.
You do see some of it a little bit in Dorne. When you think about the gardens and the fact that there is definitely, it's hinted that there is this higher culture of they're a little bit more sophisticated than their northern neighbors, and the fact that they spend a little bit more time, but they're also treated as the other and not, they were never conquered by by the Targaryens. They always had their independence, and so they're not treated.
So I guess
the same way.
that's what naturally happens when you are living a life that isn't necessarily based on survival, but so once you're done surviving, then it leaves room for thriving, and it puts you in a position where you're ready to express yourself in other ways, whether that results in monetary return or not. Because like some people just make art for the sake of making art, right? For the art's sake.
That's a very modern thing.
Is that because
that's the
the
self-actualization?
That's like the same. But you absolutely will have the I'm going to pay someone to make art to demonstrate that I have the money to prove that it's a show of power. It's a demonstration of my wealth over yours. So I'm going to pay to have those, and that's where a lot of that would come from.
I love the songs. Looks like we have to wrap pretty soon. Let's cover just a couple more points, and then we'll wrap it up. But let's talk about as an professor of entrepreneur and innovation. Where do you see this most prevalent in the show?
Entrepreneurship and innovation.
Entrepreneurship, innovation. Obviously there's the big entrepreneur, our favorite guy,
Littlefinger.
Littlefinger. I think Littlefinger is the number one businessman in the show.
Absolutely.
The most thriving venture, essentially, we see in all of Westeros is his brothel. We see no merchants of note. I think Bronn is essentially a striver and an entrepreneur in his own way, and Qyburn is the Thomas Edison of that economy. But you see, even in the glimpses we get of Essos, we see many more people, the traders and entrepreneurs.
They're all
it's an
self-made.
important class over there. It's not an important class of people in Westeros, it appears.
Littlefinger does have what seems to be the only chain of anything, because he has his chain of brothels that are known as Littlefinger's brothels. They don't really have a sign out front because no one can read it, but you put a little mockingbird or whatever,
the symbol
up it, and that's a strong indicator of this is a brand. This is a But
that would be normal. Again, it's about the personal. Because there are a lot of people who were recognized for their craftsmanship. So you think about Gendry and like the fact that he was trained as a really good blacksmith and armorer. And so I wouldn't want when everything's being custom made as a one-off, I don't really care what the person down the street is. I want him. I want to go to him and get his stuff because he has the best thing to protect me. And so it's all about that individual in the first place.
Yeah, you can't. There's some things are specialized. You can't mass produce. You can't mass produce haircuts. You know what I mean? You can't have. You know what I mean? Maybe someday they'll Game of Thrones. Someone will come up with the assembly line and they'll be racking out, horseless carriages and all kinds of cool stuff.
We see very few enterprises of scale in Game of Thrones, especially in Westeros. Think about the armorers of Winterfell. We see these one or two guys. They're arming freaking
the entire
North.
army. Exactly. Quick question: where is considering your real estate specialty, where's the best place to buy right now? Where's the most booming?
In Westeros?
Give me one spot in Westeros. One spot. I want a summer home in Essos, and I'll hunker down in Westeros.
Say Braavos, I think would definitely be sort of center, center of the economy, center of the world. King's Landing's been attacked multiple times historically, so I'm not too sold on that one.
Yeah,
I'd probably go with Dorne. Dorne has basically been warmer weather. Near where the wine is, strong, independent. I think I'd do Dorne and Braavos would be my two choices.
I like it. Yeah, what do you think?
I think you need an island now. I think we're about to have some White Walkers coming down. I think
you can have Pike all you want. That place looks really lovely.
Really.
Man, White Walkers. We didn't even get to them. They probably have a whole economy
Think
of
about
themselves.
their culture with their weapons. How did they make weapons so strong that when a regular sword touches it, it explodes?
It's true. The fact that magic is kind of involved in this universe kind of makes the whole thing not so comparable to our human history. Because
Right.
when you do have magic, it kind of throws a wrench into the way things work in the world.
They also have a good stylist. I really like the cut of their armor. I mean, it's really, it's a little Armani-like.
Yeah, they do. We got,
They do a runway walk every.
maybe we'll
once
have
in
to
a
do
while.
like a whole White Walker episode. I think we might have to.
And or the fashion of Game
Yeah,
of
they're
Thrones.
rolling with their winter armor. Their summer armor's a lot like.
This has been great. You guys, I'm so happy you were able to come in and share. I learned a lot just from listening to you talk. Maybe I'll take a class with you someday.
Come on by.
Yeah.
But that's pretty much all the time we have. Talked a little bit about the economy is good stuff. Jeremy Dann, entrepreneur, innovation professor at USC's Marshall School of Business.
That's right.
Thank you so much for coming in. Chris Hill, the venture capitalist and real estate guru of, well, we'll just say California.
Southern California.
Yeah,
there we go.
yeah. Oh, there you
So
go.
that's where we are, right?
There
Yeah, there we go.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you guys again very soon. Ross, you're a boss, as always.
He's like Madonna,
okay.
one name.
Yeah.
Ross.
That's all you need.
Ross. There you go. And I'm Ryan Malaty, and you can follow me at Ryan Malaty. You guys, is there anywhere people can catch up with you?
Ross like a boss at Instagram.
There you go. And gentlemen, back on this show maybe in a few weeks.
Okay.
Great.
All right, cool.
Absolutely.
Thank you guys so much for joining us. Stick around for next week. We same time, same place, 7 p.m. here at AfterBuzz TV, Game of Thrones Weekly. Thanks for watching and listening. See you next time.
From executive producers Maria Menounos, Kevin Undergaro, Phil Svitek, and the entire AfterBuzz TV staff, we would like to thank you for listening to the AfterBuzz TV network. To watch or listen to other after shows and post comments or questions, be sure to visit AfterBuzzTV.com. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this has been a presentation of AfterBuzz TV.
The Lannister always pays his debts.
The views expressed herein are those of the host only and do not necessarily reflect the views of AfterBuzz TV or its owners or principals.